Time is a very difficult thing to pin down. There's a famous saying of St. Augustine of Hippo that when he was asked, "What is time?" he said, "I know what it is, but when you ask me, I don't." And yet it seems absolutely fundamental to our life. Time is money, we say. I don't have enough time. Time flies. Time drags. And I think we should go into the question of what this is, because in our ordinary common sense, we think of time as a one-way motion from the past through the present and on into the future. And that carries along with it another impression, which is to say that life moves from the past to the future in such a way that what happens now and what will happen is always the result of what has happened in the past. In other words, we seem to be driven along. You know, once upon a time it was fashionable in psychology for people to speak of man's and animals' instincts. That we have, for example, an instinct for survival, an instinct to make love, and so on. But nowadays that word has become unfashionable, and psychologists tend instead to use the word drives, and to speak of the need for food as a drive, the need for survival or for sex as drives. And that's a very significant word, because it's brought out, isn't it, by people who feel driven. I must say personally, if I feel hungry, I don't feel driven. Also, if I feel lusty, I don't feel driven. Because I don't say, "Oh, excuse me, but I have to eat," or "Excuse me, but I need to fulfill my sexual urges, my biological impulses." I say, "Hooray, I identify myself with my drives. They're me." And I don't take a passive attitude towards them and apologize for them. So the whole idea of our being driven is connected with the idea of causality, of life moving under the power of the past. And that is so ingrained in our common sense that it's very difficult to get rid of it, because I want to turn the thing round completely the other way and say that the past is the result of the present. Let us suppose, just for the sake of example, that this universe started with a big bang, as some cosmologists believe. Now, when that bang happened, it was the present, wasn't it? And so the universe began in what we will call a now moment. Then it goes on doing its stuff. And always, when any event that we now call past came into being, it came into being in the present and out of the present. That's one way of seeing it. But before we get further involved in this, I want to draw your attention to a fallacy in the very common sense idea of causality. That events are caused by previous events, from which they flow or result necessarily. To understand the fallacy of that idea, we have to begin by asking, what do you mean by an event? Let's take the event of a human being coming into the world. Now, when does that event begin? Does it occur at the moment of parturition, when the baby actually comes out of its mother? Or does the baby begin at the moment of conception? Or does the baby begin when it was an evil gleam in its father's eye? Or does a baby begin when the spermatozoa are generated in the father, or the ovum in the mother. Or could you say a baby begins when its father is born, or when its mother is born? All these things can be thought of as beginnings. But we decide, for purposes of legal registration, that a life begins at the moment of parturition, and that is a purely arbitrary decision. And it has validity only because we all agree about it. Let me show you the same phenomenon in the dimension of space instead of the dimension of time. Let's ask, how big is the sun? Are we going to define the sun as limited by the extent of its fire? That's one possible definition. But we could equally well define the sphere of the sun by the extent of its heat. We could also define the sphere of the sun by the extent of its light. And each of these would be reasonable choices, except that it's rather difficult to keep track of the extent of its light, because we're inside it. And therefore we have arbitrarily agreed to define the sun by the limit of its visible fire. But you will see in all these, by these analogies, that how big a thing is, or how long an event is simply a matter of definition. Now, therefore, when by simple definition, for purposes of discussion, we have divided events into certain periods, we'll say the First World War began in 1914 and it ended in 1918. Now, actually, all those things which led up to the First World War started long before 1914, and the repercussions of that war have continued long beyond 1918. How are we to distinguish an event from its repercussions? So you will see that because we have divided events from one another in this arbitrary way, we do that, and then we sort of forget we did it. And then we have a puzzle. How do events lead to each other? Because you see, in reality, there are no separate events. Life moves along like water. And it's all connected, as the source of a river is connected to the mouth and to the ocean. And all the events or things going on are like whirlpools in the stream. Because you go there today and you see a whirlpool. You go there tomorrow and you see a whirlpool. But it isn't the same whirlpool because all the water is changing every second. What is happening is not really what we should call a whirlpool, but rather a whirlpooling. It is an activity, not a thing. And indeed, every so-called thing can be called an event. We call, say, a house, housing. We call a mat, matting. And we could equally call a cat a catting. So we could say the catting sat on the matting. And we would thereby have a world in which there were no things but only events. To give another illustration, a flame is something we say, there is a flame on the candle. But it would be more correct to say, there is a flaming on the candle, because the flame is a stream of hot gas. Let's take another amusing example. We say fist, and fist is a noun. And fist looks like a thing, but suddenly what happens to the fist when I open my hand? See, I was fisting. Now I'm handing it to you. So every kind of so-called thing can be spoken of as an event, and because events flow into each other, the fisting flows into the handing, we cannot say exactly where one ends and the other begins. So therefore, if we remember that, we shall see that we do not need the idea of causality to explain how a prior event influences a following event, because it's like this. Supposing I'm looking through a narrow slit in a fence, and a snake goes by. I've never seen a snake before, and this is mysterious. And I see through the slit in the fence, first the snake's head. Then I see a long, trailing body, and then finally the tail. I say, well, that was interesting. Then the snake turns round and goes back. And again I see first the head, and then after an interval the tail. Now if I call the head one event and the tail another, it will seem to me that the event head is the cause of the event tail, and the tail is the effect. But if I look at the whole snake, I will see a head-tailed snake, and it would be simply absurd to say that the head of the snake is the cause of the tail, as if the snake came into being, first the head and then the tail. The snake comes into being out of its egg as a head-tailed snake. And so in exactly the same way, all events are really one event. We're looking, when we talk about different events, we're looking at different sections or parts of one continuous happening. And therefore, the idea of separate events, which have to be linked by a mysterious process called cause and effect, is completely unnecessary. But having thought that way, we think of present events as being caused by past events, and therefore we tend to regard ourselves as the puppets of the past, as driven along by something that is always behind us. Now, to overcome this impression, it's very simple. You begin again with an experiment which I suggested in a previous talk about meditation. Approach the world through your ears. If you shut your eyes and make contact with reality purely with your ears, I mean, it's kind of silly perhaps to shut your eyes when you're looking at television, but do it just for a moment. And you will realize that the sounds you are hearing are all coming out of silence. You hear, and it fades away, fades, 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 and finally disappears. It's a curious world, this, isn't it? Because you hear all the realities in it, the sounds, suddenly coming out of nothing. You don't see any reason for them to begin. They just appear, and then they echo away through the corridors of the mind, which we call memory. Now, if you open your eyes, it's a little harder to see this with your eyes because, unlike sounds, the eyes sound static. Or rather, they look static. Everything looks still to your eyes. But you must understand that the world you are looking at, say when you look at a light, that light is vibrating. All material things are vibrations, and they are vibrating at you now in the same way as the sound was vibrating on your ears. In other words, the present world that you see is a vibration coming just as the sound comes out of silence. The light is coming out of space. It's coming out of nothing straight at you now and echoing away into the past. So the course of time is really very much like the course of a ship in the ocean. Because here's the ship, you see, and it leaves behind it a wake. And the wake fades out, and that tells us where the ship has been, in just the same way as the past and our memory of the past tells us what we have done. But as we go back into the past, and we go back and back to prehistory and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened, we eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship. Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog. Supposing there's a neurotic, difficult child, and one school of thought used to say, well, bang him about, beat him up, and maybe he'll change. But then they said, oh no, that's not fair to the child to beat him up because it was his parents. They didn't bring him up properly. And so then they say, well, punish the parents. Well, the parents say, excuse me, but our parents were neurotic too, and they brought us up badly, so we couldn't help what we did. And so since the grandparents are dead, we can't get at them. And in any case, supposing we could, we would pass the whole blame back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And they say they started all this mess. But then Eve would say, no, the serpent tempted me and I did eat, and it was the serpent's fault. Well, you know, when God, in the story of Genesis, asked Eve, didst thou eat the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat? She said, oh, but the serpent tempted me, and I did eat. And God looked at the serpent, and the serpent didn't make any excuse. He probably winked. Because the serpent, being an angel, was wise enough to know where the present begins. So you see, if you insist on being moved, being determined by the past, that's your game. But the fact of the matter is, it all starts right now. But we like to establish a connectivity with the past because that gives other people the impression that we're sane. If you ask me then, why am I talking? Well, I could say I'm making a living this way, or I have a message that I want to get across to you. But that is not the reason. I'm talking for the same reason that birds sing and for the same reason that the stars shine. I dig it. Why do you dig it? Well, I could go on answering all sorts of questions about human motivation and psychology, but they wouldn't explain a thing, because explaining things by the past is really a refusal to explain them at all. All you're doing is postponing the explanation. You're putting it back and back and back and back, and that explains nothing. What does explain things is the present. Why do you do it now? Now, this is a slight cheat, because that doesn't explain it either. Because what happens now, just as the sound comes out of silence, all this comes out of nowhere. This is in connection with what I explained to you in another talk about the power of nothingness. All life suddenly emerges out of space. Bang, right now. And to ask again, why does it happen, is an unprofitable question. Because the interesting thing is not why, but what. What happens? Not why does it happen. I can say, well, I am doing this now because I did that then. And so I am producing for you a continuous line of thought. But actually I'm doing it backwards. I'm doing it always from now and connecting up what I do now with what I did so that you can see a consistent story. If I define myself as the whole field of events, we'll say the organism-environment field, which is the real me, then all the things that happen to me may be called my doing. And that is the real sense of karma. But when we speak about freedom from karma, freedom from being the puppet of the past, that simply involves a change in your thinking. It involves, in other words, you're getting rid of the habit of thought whereby you define yourself as the result of what has gone before, and instead get into the more plausible and more reasonable habit of thought, in terms of which you don't define yourself in terms of what you've done before, but in terms of what you're doing now. And that is liberation from the ridiculous situation of being a dog wagged by its tail. Tonight, I want to tell you 3 fantasies, all of which have something in common. The first fantasy is about reproduction. We use the word reproduction in 2 principal ways. When we talk about the biological reproduction of the species, and when we talk about making a good reproduction of something in terms of a painting, a photograph, or a recording, or a videotape. And what is all this about reproduction in that direction? Hundreds of years ago, kings of Europe who wanted to form feudal alliances by marrying the princesses of far-off states would have painters send portraits of the lady in question to see if His Majesty approved of her before he got her. And there's a famous story in which Henry VIII of England was badly cheated in this respect by a too flattering portrait of Anne of Cleves. And therefore there grew up a kind of morale among artists in the European tradition to make faithful reproductions of people. And they perfected their technique, beginning with the marvelous work of the Renaissance painters and the Flemish painters, and going on finally to what was called art officielle in the 19th century. We got what we now call photographic realism. But then they said, isn't there some more scientific way of doing this? And so they discovered the camera. And first of all, there were, remember those brownish daguerreotypes? And people said, well, that is pretty. It really looks like Grandpa, doesn't it? And then they said, but there are several things missing. It isn't colored. So first of all, they tinted them. And then they said, well, it's real lifelike. But then they went on to say, but there are some people whose whole style of life, whose personality is in the way they move. And if you just take a static shot like that, the personality isn't there. It's the way they go. So they said, we've got to have some way of making people move. So they invented the movies. And I remember when the first movies came out, they were all going, everybody was going, in a jerky way. Then they smoothed it out and they said, oh, that's real lifelike. But they said then, but there's another thing about reproducing people, which is that they talk, and a whole lot of their personality is in the voice. So can't we have them talking at the same time that they move? So they invented the talkies. And then to get it more lifelike still, they colored them. They said, wow, now we're really getting somewhere. Then, to make it even more real, they put it in 3D. And you had to wear sort of spectacles over your face to see it that way. But then they went on to say, why is it that every time we want to see one of these things, we have to go down to the center of town? Can't we have it all at home? And so television came on. And in television, they first of all started out with black and white, and it was kind of like Robert Benchley once described the cuts in French newspapers as all looking as if they'd been made on bread. Well, that was television at a certain period. And then they improved it, and then they colored it, and that's where we are now. Not quite. Because somebody has come out with the thing that we shall all be seeing soon, which is the hologram. A television image produced by laser beams, where you see a 3-dimensional figure out in the air in front of you. I say, isn't that marvelous? Whew. And then, but of course, when you go up to it and you put your hand on it, your hand goes right through it. You can't touch it. And you see, that was always the trouble with television. because you look at whatever you're seeing behind a screen. It's intangible, it doesn't smell, and it won't relate to you. So these are further problems to be solved in the techniques of electronic reproduction. And they'll do it. They'll first of all manage a way in which the electronic emission sources can solidify and make the air vibrate so that you go up and you touch the figure and you won't be able to push your hand through it because the air will be going faster than your hand. Imagine that. You can actually, if there's a beautiful dancer on the television, you'll be able to go up and embrace her. But she won't know you're there. And she won't respond to you. And you'll say, well, that's not very lifelike. Just as they once said, if the photograph doesn't move, it's not very lifelike. If it doesn't talk, it's not very lifelike. They'll next say, if the reproduction in 3 dimensions solid doesn't respond, it's not very lifelike. So they'll have to figure out a technique for doing that. What will they do? Well, I tell you. Sitting in your home, where you're watching the scene on a kind of stage now, not on a screen, there'll be a TV camera observing you. And that TV camera will report back everything you do into a computer. And the computer will so manage each bit of information, that's to say, each tiny little granule unit of information going into the image that you're looking at, that it will immediately decide what is the appropriate response to the approach that you are making to the image. Won't that be great? You know, she may slap you in the face and she may kiss you. You never know. But then you say, no, this is still not really the kind of reproduction we wanted. What we wanted when we looked at this scene is to be able to identify with one of the characters. We wanted to not just watch the drama that's being performed on the stage in front of us, but actually get into it. And so we want to be wired in with electrodes on the brain so that we will actually feel the emotions of the people acting on the stage. And so eventually we will get absolutely perfect reproduction. And we will be able to see that image so vividly that we shall become it. And so the question arises, could that be where we are already? Are we a reproduction which over the centuries of evolution has worked out to be a replica of something else that was going on? And we are where we always were? Now the next fantasy concerns the idea that every living being thinks it's human. And that means a plant, a worm, a virus, a bacterium, a fruit fly, a hippopotamus, a giraffe, a rabbit. That all these beings, wherever they feel out from, as we feel out from our bodies, feel that they're in the middle. That is to say, wherever you look, you turn your head around, and you feel you're in the middle of the world. You feel you're the center. And a rabbit or a fruit fly feels that it is a center. And it has around it a company of associates who look like it. And therefore, this creature knows that these are the right people, just as we know when we look at human beings. They're the right people. They are one of us. Only, of course, we have to make distinctions because you never really know that you are you and that you are really in the right place unless you can contrast yourself with some other people who are, after all, not quite in the right place and some other people who are very much in the wrong place. And then, through having this succession of comparisons, you know that you're okay. Well, the insect has exactly the same arrangement. Well, you say, well, insects and things like fishes, they don't have any culture? What do you mean, fishes being civilized and being entitled to consider themselves as humans? Well, let me put the argument from the fish's point of view. Fishes say, human beings are a mess. Look what they do. They can't exist without cluttering themselves and carrying around all kinds of things outside their bodies. They have to have houses and automobiles and books and records and television and hi-fi equipment and stuff, endless stuff, and they litter the earth with rubbish. So think of a dolphin. He isn't really a fish because a dolphin's a mammal, but a dolphin's point of view towards the human race. Dolphins spend most of their time playing. They don't work because the grocery is right there in the ocean, whatever they need. And so a dolphin will catch up with a seagoing liner, and it'll get on the wake of the liner and put its tail at an exact angle of 26 degrees. And in so doing, the liner will carry the dolphin along. The dolphin will make circles around the liner just for fun, playing all its life in the water. And we know that a dolphin's brain is as big, if not bigger than ours, that it's incredibly intelligent, that it has a language which we can't decipher. And the person who knows most about dolphins in the United States, Dr. John Lilly, is a friend of mine, and he said he came to the conclusion that dolphins were too smart to tell us their language. So he abandoned this project. He said he would no longer keep such a highly civilized being in the concentration camp of the zoo, and that it should go back to the ocean. So the point is, though, that not only dolphins, but every organism that has any sensitivity in it whatsoever considers itself to be the center of the universe. Now, it has its problems. There's a Zen poem which says, "The morning glory which blooms for an hour differs not at heart from a giant pine that lives for 1,000 years." In other words, an hour is a long life to a morning glory. 1,000 years is a long life to a pine. And our 80 years and 10, or as the insurance company's actuarial tables put it, somewhere between 65 and 70 years as an average human life, seems about the right length of life. I mean, there are people who want to go on and are in quest of immortality and have their bodies frozen in case there should develop in the future some technique by which they could be revived. But I really don't go for that idea, because nature has mercifully arranged the principle of forgettery as well as the principle of memory. If you always and always and always remembered everything, you see, you would be like a piece of paper which had been painted over and painted over and painted over until there was no space left, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish between one thing and another. It's like when a whole bunch of people start to scream and make noises and out-scream each other, and soon you can hear nobody. So in that way, one's memories become screams, and nature mercifully arranges that the whole thing be erased, and you begin again. You see, it doesn't matter in what form you begin, whether you begin again as a human being, or as a fruit fly, a butterfly, or a beetle, or a bird. It feels the same way that you feel now. So we're really all in the same place. And we all have above us things much higher than ourselves. And we all have below us things that we feel are much lower than ourselves, just as there are things out there on the left and things out there on the right, and things in front and things behind. Because you're the middle. You're the middle everywhere, always. Now my third fantasy. Nobody has, it seems to me, really seriously asked the question, how do stars begin? Why? How out of space do these enormous radioactive centers arise? Well, I'm going to solve this problem on the principle of the egg and the hen, because it is said a chicken is one egg's way of becoming other eggs. And if you've understood my second fantasy, you will see how that could be true. Now let's suppose then that a planet is one star's way of becoming another star. You know, stars, when they explode, they send a lot of goo out into space. And some of this goo solidifies into balls which get in orbit and spin round the star. And in one chance in 1,000 maybe, one of those balls will become like the planet Earth. And slowly upon it will arise what some people might call a disease called the bacteria of intelligent life. And they have a notion, these things that we call alive, that they ought to go on. And, they have a fixed idea in their heads that they should keep on doing whatever it is they're doing, and they should always be doing it better. So they divide themselves into different species, and these species compete with each other in order to, as it were, flex their muscles and get better and better at whatever it is they are. And they go on doing this until one species really establishes itself as top species in the particular area on the particular planet. As we, human beings, Homo sapiens, have established ourselves as top species on Earth, whatever top means. Well then, when we have a little leisure and don't have to spend all our time finding food to put into our mouths, we start asking questions. And we look around at each other and everything and say, what is this? I mean, what's going on here? Well, some people say, that's a stupid question to ask. Why don't you just go on doing your work? Go hunting, go farming, go doing your business. They say, no, there are higher things. And so they create a special class of people who are in India called Brahmins, among us, philosophers, scientists, theologians, thinkers. And they go into this question, and they're allowed to stop farming, to stop hunting, to stop mining, to stop scrubbing floors, and to go to very special places called universities, where they can sit around and think about what is going on. Well, they think about this. First of all, they do what they call philosophy, which is they try to say what it means, what does the word be? What does the word exist mean? What do we mean when we say we're here? Well, they find they can't discuss that very far, because the word stops meaning anything. It sort of becomes a noise. They say, no, we're not really getting to the point. What we've got to do is, instead of thinking all the time and just theorizing and talking words about what's going on, we've got to investigate it experimentally. We've somehow got to look into this stuff that we call reality, a material world, and find out what it is. So they start chopping it up. See? They go into flowers and they chop up the seeds and they look into the middle of the seeds. They find something there and then they have to get a magnifying glass and look in on that. And get smaller and smaller and smaller. And they reason they must eventually come to some particle called an atom. In Greek, atom means atomos, non-cuttable. What you can't split any further. So they come down to the atomos, that than which there is no whicher, they thought. But then they found they could split that atom. They could find the electron, the positron, the meson, etc., 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 forever. And so they said, well, this is real science, because we've now found out that every atomos of matter contains immense energy, and that we could come to the point where we could release the energy in the atom. And the trouble with intellectual people is that anything that can be done must be done. And so eventually, in the necessary course of the development of nature, they found out how to blow the earth to pieces and turn it into a star. So that may be, you see, how stars originate. They have planets, like chickens have eggs, and the eggs burst and turn into chickens. And planets burst through the agency of intelligent life and turn into stars, which throw out other mud balls, which some of which stand a reasonable chance, about as reasonable a chance as, say, any male spermatozoon stands when it enters the female womb of becoming a baby. 1 in a million. And those spermatozoa are in exactly the same position as the planets and the stars. Now, I tell you, this is a fantasy. But you may ask me, isn't it a rather unpleasant fantasy? Aren't things going the wrong way, the wrong direction? In other words, if the whole point of life, I mean, this tender biological substance with all its tubes and filaments and nerves, which is so very sensitive, if all this is to end up in fire, into an absolute blaze of light, don't we say, oh, what a shame? Is that the way it ends? But so many people say that they want to see the light. They want to be enlightened. They want to dissolve into the light of God. Then when they've done that, all over again, the process goes on, and it blows out those mud balls. And here are planets, and here once again, you're a baby, you're a child, the flowers are brilliantly colored, the stars are gorgeous, the smell of the earth, the sound of the rain, everything is marvelous once again. And once again, you see the other, the man, the woman that you love. As if it had never happened before. It all starts over. And as it goes on, it gets more and more intense. All the problems get more and more problematic. And you find you're wrestling with something you can't control. You've got to control it, but you absolutely can't control it, like all the problems of the world at the present time. The whole scene is completely out of hand. And we feel we're going to our doom, because we're going once again towards the birth of a star, which is the most creative thing there is. Now, if you think about this for a while, you see, put forward 3 fantasies, all of which have a cyclic quality. We reproduce, not only biologically, but we reproduce artistically, technically. Just for a moment, I want to put in an aside about biological reproduction. See, when I think back to my grandfather, whom I knew fairly well, he was, when I was a little boy, he was something extraordinarily impressive. He looked like King Edward VII. He was a very, very elegant man, with a little goatee beard. He didn't have sideburns like this, and he had shorter hair. Very elegant fellow, dressed beautifully. And I thought, he was the very image of God. And now here I am, the same age as he was when I first knew him. And I have 5 grandchildren. And I'm sort of no longer impressed by grandfathers. Here I am. I'm one of them too. And this is the same idea, you see, of the round. That we are almost perpetually in the same place, as the French proverb says, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same thing. Well, that means then, you see, that existence, the feeling of being, is a sort of spectrum. Just as light is at one end red and at the other end violet. And you have to have these extremes in order to have color at all, in order to know light. So you see, likewise, we have to have the experience that there is somebody else, something else going on altogether out of our control, in order to have the experience of being me. And so in order to feel good, to feel that life is worthwhile, that existence is worth going on with, in order to bring out that feeling, just as the red brings out the violet, there has to be in the back of our minds, maybe very far away, the comprehension that there is something that could happen that absolutely mustn't happen, that is the horrors, that is the screaming mimes at the end of the line. We have to know that's there. And every so often, that has to happen. Because if there isn't the experience that we go through, called the screaming mimes at the end of the line, where everything has gone wrong, like just before he died, the British novelist Arnold Bennett said, "I feel somehow that everything's absolutely wrong." You know? So the possibility, even the imagination that there could be such an experience in the back of our heads, is the background which gives intensity to the sense that we call feeling good, feeling that it's all right. It's all right now. I'm only bleeding. So, if you understand that, you see that really and truly you're always in the same place. Just as every creature thinks it's a human being. And as just every being turns out to be a reproduction by some interesting technology, whether it's electronic or biological, makes very little difference. And just as it may be, I don't know, planets are stars' ways of becoming other stars, and so on, and so on, and so on. But the moral is, you're always in the same place. And what is that place? You can ask yourself very, very, I won't say seriously, because this isn't really serious, it's sincere. Ask yourself very sincerely, if that is so, if, in other words, the place in which you are now is the place where everything and everybody else really is, only there's an arrangement to pretend that you ought to be somewhere else. So the place where you are is the place where you're always pretending you ought to be somewhere else. And this is the nature of life. This is the pulse. I ought to be somewhere else. So it's a kind of a gazum like that. See? When if you discover that that's the trick that you're playing on yourself, you become serene. And you don't entirely give up the game because you've seen through it. But you say, it really might be fun to go on playing.
Well, this quality of daily life thing is an interesting point because I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago we meditated or thought about what would you do if you could do anything and how... Oh, there it is.
Just stretching the arm.
Yes. And how you imagine, or if a genie were to suddenly tell you you had not 3 wishes but thousands, and you would begin to dabble in fulfillment, and then, of course, in all the trivial and superficial things I mentioned, palaces and Ferraris and all this, but then things like that you could move anywhere instantly. How would you choose to travel if you could move anywhere instantly? and things like that. Well, at La Chirera, these possibilities were so real to us that we actually grappled with it sufficiently to see how it would develop. And how it develops is you discover that if you can do anything, the only values which have any meaning, if you can do anything and have anything, are aesthetic values. So that if you could travel anywhere instantly, how would you travel? You would walk, obviously. You know, because it's so tasteful. Because it's so completing. It's such a complete reverence for space and time and your own body and the correctness of the situation. And time and time at La Chirera, someone would be doing something some way, and someone else would say, well, if you're omniscient, why don't you just make it be done? And the answer is because it's crass to do that. You know, the way to do things, if you can do anything, is to do them right.
That's Zen, eh? Like Zen cooking is like that.
I guess. But that realization of the total richness and correctness of the moment that's the correct interpretation of the attainment of these cities. Things would go on at La Chirera as an example of how the Tao works, where I would walk out into the jungle and there would be butterflies circling, and I would hold out my hand and speak to the butterflies with my mind and invite them to come down and land on my hand and display themselves. And the butterflies would do this. They would come and land in my open hand and turn and strut and show me all facets of themselves. And this would go on for like 2 or 3 minutes, where I would experience gratitude, reverence, delight, and then this other emotion, the need to show somebody else what I could do. And so then I would walk back to the camp, and smiling with a bizarre inward smile, I would select one of my campmates and ask them to walk out into the jungle with me. And then, to their horror, I would stand underneath this tree and gesture and ask for the butterflies to come down and land in my hand. And people would just turn away in a mixture of horror and embarrassment that anyone could be such a jackass, first of all, and that anyone could be so mentally deranged as to operate like that. And of course, the butterflies would have nothing to do with me. And I would just be left just sputtering, you know, and it happened many times.
Many times? Oh, no.
Oh, many times. Because there was
that you took people and were left sputtering? Or it
was not only the butterflies. It was that as long as I had no ego, I could work magic. But it was magic that was the necessary magic. It absolutely had no use other than to make my life a more perfect work of art. As an example, we had a pot in which we cooked avena, oatmeal, every morning. It was our magic pot. And the scrubbing out of this pot was a major pain in the neck and was consequently a rotating camp duty. So in the height of this, it became my turn to scrub this pot. And I went down to the little spring where the sand was and squatted down by the water, and I picked up the sand and I rubbed it onto the pot to get ready to scrub it. And then I looked, and the black stuff was just flaking off. It was like easy off or something. And it was just, and I just took the pot, holding it by its 2 little protrusions, and immersed it in the spring like this, and looked, and all the black stuff was just flaking off and crudding off and going, and I was just amazed, you know, the magical scouring agent. So then I went back to the camp and got my most severe critic And again, smiling with inward benignness, I led them down to the river and said, I'm going to teach you how to wash a pot, the Zen master, you see. So we squat across from each other by the spring, and I pick up the sand and I put it on, and she says, so I'm supposed to know that sand can wash a pot? I say, no, look. And again it failed me, you know? And I just was, by then I was getting the message, and I stopped. And there was one other instance which was very puzzling, because I actually saw another person go into it too. And it had to do with this prophecy which my brother had made. One of the motifs which circled in his mind space during this period was what he called the good shit. And this was, he claimed, imagined, that at some time in the past he had gotten a sample of Afghani hash that had cow manure very, very carefully worked into it, and then the hash had been infected with psilocybin mycelium, and all of the cow manure had been converted into psilocybin, so that he had the psilocybinated hash. And he had this notion that he would invent a musical instrument, like an electric guitar, which when you played it, it would cause this stuff to condense out of the air and rain down on great crowds of people. So anyway, there was this thing about the good shit. And one night he announced that the good shit would appear at a certain time. And so then I went back to my hammock in this hut in the jungle, and the woman who was with me came as well. And we had no watches, but he had said that at 11 p.m. the good shit would appear. So I was settling down to roll my evening joint, and it was this Colombian weed that we had brought in with us. And as I lit the joint, this little thing fell out of the end of it on the floor, burning. And I picked it up, and I smelled it, and it was unbelievable hashish. I mean, hashish to die for. And I was just, and I put it in the pipe, and I smoked it. And I said to this woman, I said, smoke this. And she agreed that it was astonishing.
Your major critic.
No, not my major critic. My major critic was back at the river. So then I looked, and I opened this baggie with this stuff, and I started smoking it, and it didn't change its physical appearance. It still looked like this Santa Marta gold, but the odor and everything was just the finest hash I've ever smoked. So I thought that the millennium had come. Then I looked, and I opened this baggie with this stuff, and I started smoking it, and it didn't change its physical appearance. It still looked like this Santa Marta gold, but the odor and everything was just the finest hash I've ever smoked. So I thought that the millennium had come, that forever after we would all trash. Yes, the end of the world is when all trash is Mazari Sharif hash. When trash becomes hash. But at the crack of dawn the next morning, I went tearing down to my harshest critic and knelt beside her hammock and woke her up and said, you've got to smoke this. And of course, garbage was back. So I don't know why I got off into this. I guess it was the life is art thing, and this thing about what would you do if you could do anything.
Enhance that little story with the myth, isn't it, from New Guinea, about the good ship? Do you remember that one where they generated?
You mean the thing about the resin, where the resin bar grew longer? I'm not sure how this relates to it, but I'll tell it. In the study of messianic movements, in fact, you can read about this in Sylvia Thrupp's book, Millennial Dreams in Action, where she talks about a number of millennial religious groups. There was a movement around 1910 in Java called the Kalupan movement. And it was some guy was sitting on his porch one day in a hut off in the jungle, and he was playing his flute. And they collect copal in the forest there and sell to traders. And as he was playing his flute, he noticed that this bar of rolled out copal multiplied to twice its size right in front of him. And not only did this happen, but at the same moment it happened, his mind was flooded with the sudden realization that the meaning of this event was that all human lives were now going to be twice as long as they had previously been before. And he told people in his village, and he had the proof because they had this bar of copal that was twice as long than anybody ever rolled them in that village. So it spread from village to village. And before long, people from all over Java were vectoring in on this place. And eventually the army had to be sent to put up roadblocks and turn people back. And it all had to do with this piece of resin, which had doubled in length while this guy was playing his flute.
And that is what's called a cognitive hallucination.
A cognitive hallucination.
Where an idea becomes so real to you that you see it, but then there's this funny border where maybe it becomes so real that other people see it, and maybe that's actually how we keep enlarging and complicating reality, is by having these consensual cognitive hallucinations of what's possible.
That's right.
Yeah.
The ayahuasquero that Kat mentioned that we like so much and worked with in Peru, Don Fidel, he lived off this road when we knew him, a few miles down this trail, and we would go over there often and walk with him back and forth between his house and where we could catch these little jitney buses into town. And he said one afternoon as we were walking along through the Amazon jungle, apropos of nothing, he said, "This is the path that Christ walked when he lived on earth." And it became so. You saw that somehow this was not a logical statement. This was a statement about the transposition of time and dimensionality, and that he was living in the light of Christ, that he was living in the presence of the Master through being enveloped in a cognitive hallucination. And I think our entire culture is headed for being enveloped in a cognitive hallucination where our real wishes will be fulfilled. And that's why it's so important to find out what our real wishes are. One of the most powerful forms of yoga, one of the highest yogas, is what's called the Anuttara Yoga Tantra. And it involves a series of visualizations. And they say, imagine your home as a splendid palace. And imagine the common utensils of your everyday life as golden vessels, vessels of beaten gold encrusted with jewels. Imagine your raiment as being made of the finest silk, and imagine yourself as a god centered in the midst of all of this splendor. Well, this is like trying to induce what in Western psychotherapy is called a delusion of grandeur. A delusion of grandeur is when you're a hell of a lot happier than other people think you should be, you know? And say, what do you have to be so happy about? And it's all about infusing the quality of life with greater purity. We were saying around the fire last night that the way to relate to the millennium is to make it happen as soon as possible in your life so that you become a spectator to it as a historical phenomenon. Well, the way to make it happen in your life is to not transcend desire, but transmute it so that what you really want is what you actually have, you know?
I find on these plants, on the mushroom particularly, I found it effective to choose to become an archetype that those course, have to be able to identify as an archetype, but then also one that I can relate to and wish to be and become, as large, 100, 1,000 times larger than we are, and as smooth, and as everything is right. You can practice being in the Tao so deeply in those states, and knowing that everything you do, no matter how minuscule it is, you're doing most gracefully, and everything you say, you're saying most eloquently. And even I've used the mending sock thing because sometimes I feel like that's what I'm doing, is that level of work, but then I'm doing it perfectly, and that's a great feeling. If you indulge in that feeling of being the goddess or a god or goddess or one of whatever you identify with, one of the kachunas, whatever, then you can carry it back. It's a really good way to carry it back into your daily life and learn to practice it either in moments when you're wobbly and you suddenly need to grow into the situation, or in moments of ecstasy. To the archetypes making love, it's pretty good.
Well, that's the technique of tantric practice, of imagining these gods in union with their consorts, in sexual union. As the people burning to speak should speak.
Maybe one comment that in different parts I keep hearing people saying that we don't know anything, but I think we're all dancing around it very well, and I think you're dancing around it really well, and so I think we do know something, not a lot perhaps, but we do know something. If words are that important and do have that meaning, whether it's what we're saying that is true, or just a sound of our voice that is true, something is true. We're here. I think we're beginning to say the unsayable. I just have this feeling here.
And what a feeling it is.
And I think a lot has to do with trust. I'm not going to say that because I've called them through. You've got to say it, and then you move on. And so it keeps forming. That's like a creation, words, thought, idea. They attach themselves to this larger structure and keep getting larger and larger. Pieces fall off. People add. But it's just trust. It's that leap of faith to the other side of what you can't see, what you can't understand. And trust it. As you trust your lover, as you trust a friend. And it doesn't always work out, but trust is the only way. Because otherwise, there's always fear. Fear of ourselves, fear of others, fear of ideas. I think this community is part of that, of building trust among people who have different ideas.
I'd like to say something about learning and teaching with regard to the psychedelic experience. That you can use a lot of verbiage in trying to explain to people what that search is about, what that adventure will yield. But in the end, probably the best communication is to just dispense some sacrament. And I think it's very holy work, and I just want to express my appreciation to those who are involved in that work. With great respect for the sacrament and to those to whom they dispense it. And I'm just very happy to be associated with these books. I think it's something I've missed for a long time since the days of the 60s. Was the last time I was around people who knew about that work and approached it with the kind of reverence that I see here.
The great thing about the psychedelics is that they speak for themselves. So they need no priest, no interpreter. They can deliver their message all by themselves.
So my question has to do with, is there some sense of the re-emergence, or the, in the Joyce sense, here comes everybody, the democratization of that ability in future culture?
Yes, well, I think so. I think that the way these hieroglyphic languages, especially Mayan and Egyptian, differ from alphabetic languages is that etymology remains on the surface in a hieroglyphic language, so that thousands of meanings are immediately visibly present, and so it's more like an ideogram rather than a word with a dictionary meaning. You couldn't really, I doubt that a Mayan could conceive of a dictionary of Mayan glyphs, because they infinitely shade off one into another, so that and that kind of sensitivity to the depth of language and to the presence of the past in the present in a word is what Joyce is trying to do in Finnegan's Wake, and that's why if you read it carefully, you feel many historical layers of meaning in the same passage, because he wrote it with almost a pictographic consciousness of the meaning of the words rather than a linear and literary sense of it. So yes, it's in that sense it's like that. How this will be achieved in the future in our culture, I'm not sure. The control of the Macintosh through an internationally understood set of control glyphs is very weird. And if any of you have worked with a Macintosh, you immediately see, this idea which seems very odd could in fact, I could learn this very quickly and anyone can do it, kind of thing. Maybe presages a world of illiterate computer users who communicate with computers through symbols because literacy has been lost. But it's very interesting. Yeah.
So you see, computers might play a role in that kind of visual component. Actually, I've heard you talk about, actually, Bruce, when you asked your question about will computers become intelligent in life, I've heard you talk about it more that the technology of computers will become available to us as almost a biological extension and beyond.
Yes, that's what I think will happen. But my vision of a perfect world is where, the Earth is restored to its prehistoric Edenic perfection, but technology has not been eliminated. It's merely been micro-miniaturized to the point where the computers which maintain the history of the race and the governance of the planet have all been secreted in a certain pebble which lies on a certain beach somewhere on the planet, and we walk around in perfect harmony with nature and in perfect and complete touch with an imaginary holographic world that is our self-expression, as a city is our self-expression, to then be simultaneously, in the world of techne and in the world of nature, but with neither violating the other. And I think that's reasonable. In fact, I think perhaps, in a sense, this is what so-called pre-literate cultures in the Amazon and places have achieved. That's how it looks to them from the inside. They have an extremely rich inner life. It isn't maintained by vast computer networks and projected into holographic space and taped onto magnetic tape and all of that, but it's still, in feeling, it's the notion that the richest world is within, and that you promote a balance with the exterior world, but then the purpose of the leisure created when you have achieved balance is not then to accumulate things, but to explore the interior horizon of transcendence through the recitation of myth and ecstasis and this sort of thing.
Terence, in connection with Robin's question, conjunction with it, could you further elaborate this idea of the material externalization of the soul and the internalization of the body as a definitive thing in evolution?
Well, I think imagination is where we want to go. That this has become the arrow of our epigenetic development, because everybody says in the future you'll have everything you want. Well, if we believe this, then we have to think seriously about what everything you want is. I mean, obviously, you want plenty of food, plenty of clothes, plenty of money, plenty of friends. But then if you get all that, and then they say, well, you haven't even dented your credit account. Well, then it says, well, I want to live at Versailles, surrounded by brilliant robots and I want great writers and artists to have lunch with me every day, and the Hope Diamond and Rembrandts. And eventually this becomes very silly, and instead there is an ascent toward truly grandiose aspirations, truly bodhisattvic calling. And I think that the imagination is the real frontier. This is why the poets and the artists are so important, and this is why I think one of the aspects of the space thing that is never mentioned by the L5 Society or any of these engineering types who are so into it is the interesting thing about outer space. We are not going to go through space to other worlds. That will be very incidental to going into space. Going into space means going into space. That space itself is a medium with unique properties for a species such as ourselves. And one of those unique properties is that engineering, which on the surface of the planet has to always be cognizant of stress and bearing loads and the limitation of materials, engineering is just going to become like ballet. And objects miles in extent can be created that are obedient only to the laws of the human imagination. And of course, the funding available to create these things. But in other words, the constraints of nature are pretty much lifted. Outer space is very much like what you see when you close your eyes in a dark room. It's a vast, unfilled void into which anything whatsoever can be projected. The hallucinations of the individual are the cultural artifacts of the species 500 years from now. I mean, all these visions and dreams that we have will be realized. I mean, in ways that we cannot imagine, but realized nevertheless. This has been consistently what has been going on. The alchemical dreams of the 16th century are fully realized in the 20th century, And of course it has facets that they never imagined. But going into space and going into the imagination is the same thing. And in the same way that the New World presented a tremendously tight genetic filter to immigrants so that only the soldiers of fortune, the religious fanatics, and exiles came to this place, and that created a unique gene mix. Space is going to be a much tighter genetic filter. I mean, most people who go are going to be very smart and very healthy, and very quickly, I think, a space type will arise. But I don't think you can create a space-based civilization without recourse to psychedelic plants and the psychedelic experience, because it's too much the same thing. If you don't integrate psychedelics into the leap to space and realize that what is happening is that more and more we perfect the aspiration to vertical ascent. In the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, you get this. Then in the brothers Montgolfier and their gas-filled balloon, and then the Wright brothers, and then the Apollo project. All of these things are, this aspiration to ascension. And it is apparently a biological drive. I mean, some people have suggested it's a nostalgia for the canopies of the rainforests that no longer exist. But whatever it is, it's going to take us eventually out to the stars and inward to the stars, because, the real question mark which hangs over all this is the nature of mind. And we do not know what mind is. And yet everything goes on upon the stage that is conditioned by and assumes mind as a given. And every society has assumed that it had the answers, that just 15 years more of fine-tuning of the current ideology would do it. And no society has ever been right about that. So why should we be right? We are hurtling toward an unimaginable future in the same way that our present would have been unimaginable to people 200 or 500 years ago. But it is the imagination, because it is consciousness that is growing and expanding and strengthening itself. And if we take the notion that these psychedelic plants are consciousness expanding agents, this is what they were originally called, consciousness expanding drugs. If you take that seriously for a moment, how can you not center it in your life? I mean, obviously consciousness is what must be expanded as fast as possible at all costs, in all times and places, because it is a lack of consciousness that will be toxic to our species and the planet. Consciousness is the saving grace, and so it has to be cultivated by any means available. Yeah.
You're saying that this urge to go into space is something like a biological urge, and also maybe something relating to like the rainforest. And
well, I think we're like the trigger species.
Yeah. Well, the point I want to make is that, when we think of going to space, we're so human-centered, and it's like, yes, us as humans can exist in space and exist there, but I think what's really important about going away from this planet's surface is it's not just a human-centered thing, it's a totally biological thing, and that we are just the implements of it. We are the thinking, conscious, creative tool makers that will be able to implement this, getting off of this gravity trap, this gravity well. But it's not just for humans, for all life, and we have to. It'll be a complete synthesis of all biological life that will exist away from the planet.
If we go to space, we will take everybody with us.
Just like in a rainforest, it's not just. It's everything.
That's right. We are the species that is deputized to use energy to do the thing for all life on the planet. That's why I'm not pessimistic about history, and I don't see history as unnatural or somehow opposed to nature. What history is a 10,000-year process by which the monkeys attain enough understanding of physical processes to build the habitats into which all life on the planet can then migrate. That's what I was talking about this morning. And I said, I think the planet senses the finiteness of its existence, and that biology is a wild scheme for getting out stars, for dispersal of life. And you're right. No, though we have great hubris and believe we are doing this and man will go to the stars, it's more that man is the pecking beak of the cosmic chick in the egg of life on Earth. And the entire bird will emerge and fly. But it was man with his atomic weapons and his radar and all this who can break the shell, and then the whole of the biosphere will flow outward into space and escape the cycle of energy degradation that will eventually turn this solar system into a group of cold cinders rotating around a red giant or something. Yes, well, we're trying to compare our maps. Everybody has seen different pieces of a geography whose total size we don't know. So we don't know, maybe none of our maps overlap, or maybe some do and some don't. And maps which don't overlap are not invalidated. It just means nobody has been there but you. I mean, I often have the feeling that I'm seeing things that no one has ever seen before. Often. Leon asked me to talk about time. Leon is off on alone time, so he'll miss this. The thing that really interests me or draws me back to the psychedelic experience again and again is the notion that there's something that you can learn that would somehow be have an impact on society at large. That when you have the psychedelic experience, it's like you're a sailor on some kind of a vast ocean where you let down your net into the deeps, and the hope is that you will snare an idea of some sort and of some size, and it may be, that you come up with the equivalent of tuna, which is many small ideas, and perhaps you bring up your nets and see that they have just been shredded by something so large that you scarcely care to imagine it. But the hope is to land an idea of intermediate size that you can then fully explore and understand. When you go into that ocean as a swimmer, you see these things passing in review, things of such beauty and intricacy and complexity that you are literally speechless, and even speechless in terms of an interior dialogue about what you're seeing. You can't, it just blows your mind and washes past you in such profusion that there seems to be the notion of capturing it seems to be like the notion of a child emptying the ocean with a cup. But if you have a net, and I'm not sure what a net is exactly, but it's a way of somehow capturing these psychedelic ideas and then bringing them back for examination. And I think part of it rests on a technique of cyclical recitation to yourself of what you've seen, so that you carry a vision to a level of reflection in memory as you pull away from it. And then 10 minutes later you tell yourself again what has just happened, and then 20 minutes later again, so that you get a series of telescoping images which are granted a compression of the original event, but nevertheless they bear the stamp of what the thing was. So the thing of this class that has happened to me is a very peculiar idea about time, which was developed fairly suddenly, as I would imagine ideas develop in me in the early and mid-70s. And then it was pretty much formulated in my head, but it took the invention of small computers to make it possible to write software so that I could actually talk to other people about this idea. Well, since we have no computers and not even a blackboard, this will be a kind of feeling-toned excursion into talking about this theory of time. It has an abstract foundation and a practical foundation. Its abstract foundation is the notion that time is different than we have come to conceive of it as the legacy of Western science. The legacy of Western science is that time is duration, that time is a dimension necessary for process, and it's usually thought of as a flat plane against which some other fluctuating variable can be plotted. This is called, linear time. And Newton's physics took the same view of space. The Newtonian view of space was that it was essentially emptiness. It was something which you had to have if you wanted to put something somewhere. So it was a kind of an abstract plenum. But Einstein showed that space is actually some kind of thing. It has properties of thingdom. It is distorted in the presence of a large magnetic field. And so it rose out of the realm of abstraction and then was cognized as an objectifiable entity, a topological manifold that was real. This is, I think, the same step that has to be taken for time. Time is not simply the dimension of duration required for the successive occurrence of occasions. It is rather some kind of conditioned topological manifold. We can think of it as a fluid medium flowing across a surface, a river, in other words. In some places, the river is very broad and shallow and meanders because the pitch of the incline over which it's moving is so slight that it can barely discern which way to move. You see this often in the Amazon. In other situations, the incline increases and the speed of the flow increases and the depth of the channel increases and the distance between the banks decreases. So time runs slowly and it runs quickly. It has a kind of modulated speed. Well, it's been a commonplace of Western cosmology since Darwin, although it's never been elevated to the status of a law or even a principle, that steady complexification has occurred in the universe since its very beginning, that this is something that we see in the very first moments of physics and proceeding right up into our own day. In other words, in the era before physics, that period of time so short that it's the period of time, it's less than the amount of time necessary for the photon to cross the radius of the nucleus of the atom. There was absolute chaos and a complete absence of physics. And then what sprang into being was a physics of pure electrons, of pure energy. And it was not for many seconds that temperatures fell to a point such that other factors could come into play, such that free electrons could fall into atomic orbitals and this sort of thing. And at each successive level of cooling, new forms of order became possible. At first, everything was just this plasma of particles and energy, and then atomic systems sprang into being. And then at still lower temperatures, these atomic systems were able to form molecular systems. The energy level in the general medium dropped below the level at which it would disrupt the molecular bond. So then molecules came into being. And then at that point, there was the aggregation of stars and the cooking out of the heavier elements through the process of cooking hydrogen, so that iron and carbon, these things, then arose. And by this time, the universe is much cooler than it was at the beginning. And then finally, you get temperature regimes and environmental situations where very large colloidal molecular species can come into being, large polymerized molecules, and this sets the stage for DNA, which once it emerges And the thing to notice at each of these stages of complexification is that it requires a shorter time than the processes preceding it. If the universe is, let's take the long view and say 20 billion years old, then the first 10 billion years, not very much happened that was interesting in the realm of complexity. There was star formation and the percolation of heavy chemistry, but not life, or it's doubtful that life occurred in the early universe. So what we see then is the emergence of more and more complex animal forms at a greater and greater speed, and then finally the emergence of self-reflection in the primates, and then epigenetic methods of encoding information, in other words, writing and storytelling and language. And at each point, what is happening is there's a progressive time binding of energy and a progressive intensification and speed up of the complexification of certain parts of the universe. Right now, the most complex part of the universe that we know is the human brain mind situated in its network of computers and cultural conventions and social obligations and expectations and hopes and fears and historical aspirations, etc. And this is the realm of the densely packed that the Buddhists are talking about. So it seems to me that this should be seen as the operation of a general law, and we are not outside of this. We are in fact the cutting edge of it. Somehow, of all the animal species on the earth, the human beings are carriers of this temporal speeding up process, which is now engulfing the entire planet. And so that's the general law, or the general perception upon which this idea I elaborated was based. The notion that complexification is being conserved through time and being built up as some quality that the universe is very interested in maintaining. And then I looked at the I Ching, which I hope is familiar to most of you. I'm sure it probably is. It's a very ancient Chinese oracle system that uses what are called hexagrams, which are 6-leveled ideograms of broken or unbroken lines. And the possible subset of these things is 64, which is an interesting number because it's the number which DNA operates on, because it uses 64 codons. And in fact, I came to see that as no coincidence, that actually life was organized around this number, and the I Ching as well, because both were subject to a set of rules which was surfacing in the phenomenon of biological organization and the organization of a Chinese oracular theory for understanding past and future time. And I looked at what is called the sequence, which is the way in which you move from one hexagram to the next. And I sought order there and found order that I think had been lost since pre-Han, perhaps pre-Zhou time. And I came to see the I Ching as we possess it today as an archaeological artifact, a piece of broken machinery. It's like the turbine of a jet plane. You puzzle over it and you see that it could be used for something, and you do use it for things, and it's very effective, but it's really a piece of broken machinery from a very ancient technology which ceased to exist before the rise of the Han Dynasty. And what it was it was like a Taoist technology of understanding time, that by the practice of certain techniques whose historical echoes I think you get in the stilling of the heart techniques of Vajrayana Buddhism, these people were able to see into the quantum mechanical foundations of thought and consciousness, and they noticed there a flux, which they called the Tao, and it was a thing which came and went. The Tao Te Ching says the way that can be told of is not an unvarying way. And they stilled their body functions and they looked inward with a cataloging, analytical mentality. And they noticed that while this flux was variable, it seemed to be not infinite in its contributing factors, but that in fact it seemed to have a pattern. And they discerned the pattern as revolving around the number 64. In other words, they discerned through this process of meditation temporal elements that had a kind of ontological validity that the material elements of the periodic table have for matter. That there is not one kind of time or two kinds of time, but actually 64 facets of the possible temporal jewel. And they saw that any moment in time was the combination and the overlay of this wave system, which they called Tao, and it was a harmonic wave system. It had periods of self-expression which were very short in duration, on the order of seconds or hours or microseconds. It had levels of expression which were cognizable in the human world as years and decades and centuries, and it had vast resonant periods which were as large as history and then larger many times, periods of historical or periods of temporal resonance which could only be referenced to the life of the planet. And this is, I think, part of the Chinese notion of the Tao of heaven, earth, and man. These are different speeds at which these temporal waves of conditioning of the world of phenomenal appearance are moving. And if you take an idea like this seriously, even as a personal discipline of thought, to picture it, to visualize it in a Vajrayana spirit, then you see that what's really being offered is a map of time. It's saying that the condition of knowing a fading past and facing an unanticipatable future is not an ontologically given necessity of existence, that it is possible to imagine an existence in which one saw into time the way we as animals see into the space in front of us, so that we are able to run and leap and dance among the rocks. It's because we can see into space. A creature or a culture that could see into time could anticipate where the river of time would flow quickly, where it would broaden out and move slowly with a rich sense of the conservation of accomplishments achieved, where it would cascade and break up its previous patterns and produce great cataracts of novelty. A civilization which knew these things, or a person which knew these things about their own life, would claim a new dimension of existential freedom for being. And, I was having this whispering entity, this daemon, this logos, show me these things, and it was expressed on a very, very practical level. I mapped what is called the first order of difference in the sequence of the I Ching. That means how many lines change as you go from one hexagram to another. And I discovered that it looked like a random wave. It looked like a stochastic slice, except that at the beginning and the end, there were tongue and groove points of fit if you rotated the thing 180 degrees and brought it down against itself. so that the thing achieved closure at the beginning and the end. This satisfied me that I was dealing with an artifact of nature, that I was dealing with an organized structure, either of nature or created by intelligence. And then using the principle of hierarchical resonance and stacking of modules into hierarchies, which is really the principle by which all Chinese metaphysics has operated from the very beginning, I created a cosmic calendar where each level was a resonance of the level below it, but either collapsed or multiplied by a factor of 64. I discovered recall that because the I Ching is 64 hexagrams with 6 lines in each hexagram, it's composed basically of 384 yao, or lines. And I discovered that this number, 384, has a very interesting property. The cycle of the moon is 29.5 days. So that if you take 29.5 times 13, it's something like 383.93. And it seemed to me then immediately obvious that part of what the machinery of the I Ching was describing in the humanly cognizable phenomenal world was the cycle of the moon, using a 384-day lunar calendar, which precessed 19 days a year against the solar calendar. And when you take that 384-day unit and multiply it times 64, you get 67 years and some months and days. This is exactly 6 11-year sunspot cycles. And China is the first place where we have historical records of the observation of sunspots. So that's one sunspot cycle for each line in the 6-line hexagram. Also, sunspot cycles have a greater peak every 3rd cycle. So that's one large sunspot cycle for each hexagram in that trigram. And I saw then that there were these resonances. When you take that number, 67 years, again times 64, you get 4,306 years. And that works out to, 4,306, 150 years for each zodiacal sign. So it's like each zodiacal sign is slotted to one trigram. And these are all, notice that all these things that this resonance calendar is predicting are things visible to the naked eye. We're talking about movements of constellations, sunspots, and the moon. So I saw then that this was a tremendously powerful natural calendar that was a technology developed by proto-Taoist Central Asian shamanism very, very long ago. But it had this curious property of when the wave was mathematically analyzed in modern mathematical methods, so that we could draw these maps of novelty, we could see then that it showed us the map of the temporal river from earliest beginnings to the collapse of the state vector at some time in the future. And so it was obvious then that if we could lay the map over the portion of reality we had already experienced, we could then propagate the map forward into the future and know and begin to take hold of ourselves in this other temporal dimension. And so it became a question of what is the best fit of this undulating wave of novelty. And I used the word novelty out of Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy, because he had this notion that novelty was the compressing of a force which knits things together. And I liked that. That's what I felt it was, that the Tao is making itself, and that this compression of novelty through the speeding up of time will eventually reach a place where everything is connected to everything else. And this is, the universe's self-birthing of itself. Well, you must be aware of all these very straight studies which say if we keep increasing how fast we go, by the year 2020 we'll go to 10 times the speed of light. If we keep increasing how much energy we release, by so-and-so we'll release the energy in the sun. The propagation of all these curves of development become asymptotic, and then nobody knows how to interpret what they mean. They just seem to mean that the whole culture is going to go kazowie, And this is sort of the idea that this theory implies. It implies that far from the universe being a steady state entity uninfluenced by the existence of the human mind, which is going to go on and exist for billions of years until the stars burn out and the second law of thermodynamics is going to reduce everything to heat death, that's all wrong, 100% wrong. And that actually the universe is made by mind, within and without organism, and that mind is capable of bootstrap leaps in its organizational self-expression, and that we are privileged to be the witnesses of the final act of life going through some kind of immense transformative unfolding from itself in a kind of vortex which has been building on this planet for billions of years, but which has been accelerating to, such excruciating intensities over the last 25,000 years that it has called forth self-reflective intelligence from the monkeys and the invention of quantum physics and space flight and shamanism. And it is novelty upon novelty, novelty so intensified that the genetic machinery can no longer carry it, and it bubbles out into the epigenetic, into art and language and poetry and religion and religious mania and romanticism and all of these things. It is a progressive knitting together, an expression of the universe's will to become, that causes me to think that we may be in the shorter gyres, as William Butler Yeats called them, the shortening spirals of this vortex of novelty and compression. You see a curious quality about this kind of cosmology that I'm describing, a cosmology where each epoch is preceded by an epoch which is a 64 times greater in duration. The curious thing about that is that you only need about 20 instances of multiplication before you go from a period of time smaller than the duration of Planck's constant, which is 1.55 times 10 to the minus 23, which is a very short period of time, to then by 20 multiplications of 64, you reach a period of time in excess of the required time for the age of the universe, a period of time on the order of 72 billion years. Well, if each time the spiral goes into a state of collapse at the end of one of its cycles, then in the last 384 days of the existence of a universe like that, it would transit through half of its epochs of transition. Do you see what I mean? It's like a screaming Mimi. It really winds up. And instead of the vision which physics gives us is that the really rapid transitions of phase and state occurred at the beginning of the universe. Whole professional lives are given over to discussing the first 10 picoseconds of the physics of the universe, right? And while I'm saying I don't care about that. I think that the really interesting stuff will happen in a big hurry at the end of the universe, that the picture that the second law of thermodynamics gives us of just, tumescence, maximum detumescence, is what it's picturing, is all wrong, and that actually this strange hyperdimensional force in the universe called life and information transfer is in the process of working itself up into a real tizzy and wrapping all space and time around itself. And what was startling and what made me think that maybe I was losing my marbles was that when you look at time that way and push these novelty graphs against the historical continuum, I reached the conclusion that we entered the last 67-year period before the collapse of the state vector. At 8:30 in the morning on August the 6th, 1945, when the atomic bomb went off over Hiroshima, you see, it was a temporal reflection of the birth of the universe. It was actually you could call it an event, which was a reincarnation of the Big Bang, because each cycle begins with a bang. And that cycle, the fact that human beings had used atomic weapons on other human beings, meant that we had entered a new era, a new epoch of moral danger, and the stakes had been raised, by a power of 64 to a new level. Now, using the mathematics inherent in the cycle, if you propagate forward from that date, 67 years, 104.25 days, you reach late November of 2012 AD. And I concluded, based on all kinds of factors, personal and historical and so forth, that that was the fit. That if Hiroshima was day one, then the place where it all came together was this date in 2012. And I worked with that for several years before some kind soul, Henry Munn, I think, pointed out to me that the Mayan calendar, which is a cycle of the long count calendar I'm now talking about, is a cycle of 13 time periods, which are called Baktuns. And the Baktun is 396 years in duration. After 13 Baktuns, the world ends completely. And the 13th Baktun of the classical Mayan long count calendar is the winter solstice of AD 2012. Within 30 days of the date that I had fastened in on using a completely different path of analysis. And so this raised all kinds of questions, one of which is it simply that individuals and civilizations who take mushrooms become, I want to say, privy/engulfed by a certain mathematical secret about the cosmic machinery? What is so important about this date in 2012? The Mesoamerican cultures have the most uncanny history of successful prophecy in the world. I mean, the Aztecs anticipated the coming of the Spanish. The book of Chilambalam gives the day when the Spaniards would weigh anchor off the coast of Mexico. And of course, the fact that it happened exactly as prophesied was a major undoing of that civilization. So I put this out. This was a very confusing experience for me to channel or transmit this idea, because I was interested in the I Ching. I had carried it with me in India. I used to throw it at each full moon, but I was not mathematically inclined. And when reading the philosophy of science, and people like Paul Feyerabend and Imre Lakatos, and reading the history of science, and Thomas Kuhn, and all of those people, trying to understand, what is a true idea What is true and what is false? And when you have an idea which makes claims as sweeping as these, then you want to try to understand just what the limits of knowability are. And I discovered that all you can require of any idea is that it be self-consistent, that it not generate any contradictions within its own set of rules, you see.